The morning Los Angeles woke up to snow was the morning everything changed for 15-year-old Marcus Williams. Snow in LA wasn't just rare, it was impossible, like finding hope in a broken system or justice on empty streets. But there it was, falling like frozen tears from a gray sky that seemed to mirror the weight pressing down on the city's forgotten children. Marcus pulled his torn hoodie tighter as he walked down the sidewalk, his worn sneakers crunching through the thin layer of white that coated the concrete. In his hands, he clutched a notebook, not just any notebook, but his lifeline. Inside those water-stained pages were his dreams, sketched in pencil and hope. Go back to school. Find Mom a safe place to heal. Make something that matters. Each word was a prayer written by a boy who had learned too young that the world doesn't listen to prayers from kids like him. 2 months on the streets had taught Marcus to be invisible. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. Move fast, but don't run. Running makes you look guilty of something. His mother Teresa lay in a hospital bed across town, her body broken by a hit-and-run driver who had stolen not just her health, but their entire world. Without insurance, without family, without anyone who cared enough to fight the system, Marcus had become another ghost haunting the streets of America's dream city. Meanwhile, just 4 blocks away, 2 giants jogged through the falling snow. John Cena, his bright green shirt clinging to his massive frame, ran alongside Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, whose breath came out in powerful bursts of steam. These weren't just celebrities out for a morning workout. They were 2 men who had climbed from nothing to everything, carrying the weight of their own histories with every step. "Next time we check the weather app," Cena muttered, shaking snowflakes from his cap. The cold bit at their skin, but neither man complained much. They had both known real cold before, the cold of empty refrigerators, eviction notices, and dreams deferred. Success hadn't erased those memories, it had sharpened them. "I like surprises," Dwayne replied, though his voice carried an edge. Something felt different about this morning, electric and dangerous, like the air before a storm. They had no idea that destiny was about to collide with injustice just around the corner, or that a boy named Marcus was about to become the center of a moment that would shake the foundations of everything they believed about right and wrong. The city hummed quietly around them, people bundling up against the unusual weather, hurrying toward coffee shops and subway stations. But beneath the surface calm, tensions that had been building for generations were about to explode. In a country where a young black man's existence could be seen as suspicious, where walking while black could be treated as a crime, Marcus was about to discover just how quickly a normal morning could turn into a nightmare. As they turned onto the side street, both Cena and Dwayne slowed their pace. Something was wrong. Ahead, near a brick convenience store, a small crowd had gathered, but they stood at a distance, like people watching a fire they're afraid might spread. Phone cameras were already recording, that modern reflex that turns every citizen into a potential witness to history. 2 police cruisers sat at the curb, their red and blue lights painting the falling snow in colors that reminded Marcus of blood and bruises. 3 officers stood in front of him now, their badges gleaming like false promises of protection and service. The boy who had been invisible just moments before was now the center of attention he never wanted. The bald officer spoke first, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Hands on the wall. But Marcus couldn't move. Fear had frozen him more completely than the winter air ever could. This was the moment every black parent warns their children about, the conversation that starts with "when you encounter police," instead of "if you encounter police." In his grip, the notebook trembled, pages filled with hope about to be scattered by a system designed to break spirits like his. Marcus didn't know that just 50 feet away, 2 of the most powerful men in entertainment were watching, their own hearts beginning to race with recognition and rage. The boy standing against that wall wasn't just Marcus Williams anymore. He was every child who had ever been judged by the color of his skin instead of the content of his character. He was every dream deferred, every future cut short, every parent's worst nightmare playing out in broad daylight under a sky that seemed to weep frozen tears. And as the first officer stepped forward with intentions that had nothing to do with justice, 2 giants prepared to remind the world that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear workout clothes and carry hearts too big to let evil win without a fight. The snow continued to fall, each flake a witness to what was about to unfold, a moment that would prove that even in the darkest times, even when the system fails, there are still people willing to stand up and say, "Not today. Not on our watch. Not to this child." The notebook hit the ground with a sound that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Not loud, just the soft thud of dreams meeting concrete. The wind caught the pages immediately, scattering his carefully written hopes across the wet pavement like autumn leaves, except these leaves contained a boy's entire future. "I didn't do anything," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. But the bald officer wasn't listening. He never intended to listen. In his mind, Marcus had already been tried and convicted of the crime of existing while black in America. "You fit the description," the red-headed cop snapped, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Marcus's terrified face back at him. "That's all we need." The sunglasses were a shield, a way to avoid seeing the humanity in the boy standing before him. It's easier to brutalize someone when you don't have to look into their eyes. "What description?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking with the weight of knowing the answer. He had been walking. That was his crime. Walking while young, walking while black, walking while daring to exist in a space that some people believed he didn't belong in. The response came not in words, but in violence. The bald officer's hands connected with Marcus's shoulders, shoving him hard against the brick wall. The impact sent shockwaves through the boy's thin frame, and his notebook, his most precious possession, fell to the ground. What happened next revealed the true character of the man wearing badges that morning. The red-headed officer stepped forward deliberately, raised his boot, and brought it down on the notebook with the full force of his hatred. The wet pages squished under his soul, and he ground them into the pavement with a twist of his foot that spoke of pure malice. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mockery that cut deeper than any physical blow could. 50 feet away, John Cena felt his breath catch in his throat. "He just shoved him," he said, but the words came out strangled with disbelief. This wasn't law enforcement. This was something else entirely. Something dark and familiar that both he and Dwayne had seen too many times before. The third officer, younger than the others, stood nearby with his body language screaming discomfort. His name was Officer Rodriguez, and everything inside him was telling him this was wrong. But the weight of the badge on his chest felt heavier than his conscience. He had been trained to follow orders, to respect the chain of command, but he had never been trained for this moment when following orders meant abandoning his humanity. Then came the moment that changed everything. The bald officer walked to his cruiser with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. The engine roared to life, and suddenly the 2-ton vehicle became a weapon. Marcus heard the engine rev, and turned just in time to see the bumper lurching toward his knees. Time slowed. Marcus jumped sideways, his reflexes honed by months of surviving on the streets, saving his life. He hit the curb and tumbled to the pavement, his backpack slamming against the ground, his body rolling across the wet concrete. The crowd gasped. Phones captured every second, and the red-headed officer laughed, actually laughed, at a 15-year-old boy who had just nearly been killed by a police vehicle. "Reflexes look fine to me," he said, as if attempted vehicular assault was some kind of joke. That laughter was the sound of a system so broken that attempted murder had become entertainment for those sworn to protect and serve. It was the sound of institutional racism so deep that a child's life could be treated as worthless, disposable, a punchline to a joke that wasn't funny. But the laughter died when two giants stepped off the curb. John Cena and Dwayne Johnson moved across the street with the kind of purposeful stride that comes from men who have decided that enough is enough. Their celebrity meant nothing in this moment. They weren't actors or wrestlers or entertainers. They were human beings watching another human being get brutalized, and their humanity demanded action. "Yo!" Cena called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never backed down from a fight that mattered. "You just tried to hit that kid with your car." The bald cop stepped out of his cruiser, slamming the door with the kind of aggressive posture that bullies use when they think their authority is being questioned. "Walk away, gentlemen. This is police business." "Police business?" Dwayne's voice carried a tone that could freeze fire. "It looks like assault." The red-headed officer scoffed, puffing out his chest like a playground bully. You want to be heroes or something? We just don't like cowards, Cena replied, stopping a few feet away. Especially ones in uniform. The young officer, Rodriguez, looked between the two groups with growing panic. Everything he had been taught about respecting authority was colliding with everything he knew about right and wrong. The badge on his chest felt like it was burning into his skin. Maybe we should just, he started to say. Shut up, the bald officer snapped. They're interfering. But interference was exactly what was needed. Sometimes the system is so broken that the only way to fix it is for people with power to step in and say no. Sometimes justice requires interference with injustice. The red-headed officer's hand moved to his baton, and Marcus, still on the ground, felt terror grip his heart. This was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined. All he had wanted was to walk to the store, maybe find a warm place to sit for a few minutes. Now he was watching two of the most famous people in the world prepare to fight police officers over him. The baton came out, gleaming in the gray morning light, like a symbol of everything wrong with the world. As it rose into the air, aimed at a boy whose only crime was existing, Marcus closed his eyes and waited for the blow. But it never came. The baton never reached its target because John Cena's reflexes were faster than hatred. His hand shot out like lightning, catching the weapon mid-swing with a grip that could crush steel. The red-headed officer's eyes went wide behind his sunglasses as he realized he had just tried to attack a man who could bench press a car. Wrong move, Cena said, his voice deadly calm. With one fluid motion, he twisted the baton from the officer's grip and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The impact sent the cop stumbling backward into the snow, his sunglasses flying off to reveal eyes wide with shock and fear. The bald officer reached for his own weapon, but Dwayne Johnson was already there. The Rock's massive hand clamped down on the cop's wrist with crushing force, stopping the draw cold. In one swift movement, he slammed the officer against the hood of the police cruiser, so hard the metal buckled under the impact. Don't even think about it, Dwayne growled, his face inches from the cop's. The officer who had moments before been terrorizing a child was now trembling against his own vehicle, suddenly understanding what it felt like to be powerless. Officer Rodriguez stood frozen, his taser drawn, but his hands shaking like leaves in a hurricane. His entire world was crumbling around him. Everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about authority and justice, was being rewritten in real time. Don't, Dwayne said, turning those intense eyes toward the young officer. It wasn't a threat. It was advice from someone who recognized a good man trapped in a bad situation. Rodriguez looked around at the scene, his fellow officers on the ground, phones recording from every angle, a teenage boy still cowering against a brick wall. He slowly lowered his weapon, making a choice that would define the rest of his career and quite possibly save his soul. Marcus sat on the cold pavement, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with disbelief. 2 minutes ago, he had been alone against a system designed to destroy him. Now John Cena was crouching beside him, gently picking up his ruined notebook from the slush. This yours? Cena asked, his voice completely different now, gentle, caring, human. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt like it was closing up, not from fear this time, but from something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. You okay? Dwayne asked, joining them while keeping one eye on the officers. They said I look like someone, Marcus whispered. I was just walking. The words hit both men like physical blows. They had heard this story before, lived variations of it, watched it play out in headlines and hashtags and heartbreak. But seeing it unfold in front of them, watching a child's innocence get shattered by institutional cruelty, brought back every memory of injustice they had ever witnessed or experienced. You didn't do anything wrong, Cena said firmly. They did. The bald officer groaned from where he lay sprawled on the ground, one hand pressed against his ribs. You can't, he started to say. We just did. Dwayne interrupted, pulling out his phone to start recording. And now the world is going to see what really happened here. The sirens in the distance were getting louder. Someone in the crowd had called for backup, but by now the entire incident was being live-streamed from multiple angles. Social media was already exploding with footage of two celebrities taking down corrupt cops to protect a child. The red-headed officer struggled to sit up, blood trickling from his nose. "Wait," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "You can't do this to us." "No," Cena replied, helping Marcus to his feet. "You did this to yourselves." Marcus stood on shaking legs, still clutching his damaged notebook to his chest. For the first time since the snow started falling, he felt warm. Not physically. The cold air still bit at his skin through his torn hoodie, but something inside him had thawed. Someone had stood up for him. Someone had seen him as worth protecting. The moment felt suspended in time as the sirens grew closer. The crowd had thickened, phones held high, documenting everything. But unlike every other viral video of police brutality, this one had a different ending. This time, the bullies hadn't won. Dwayne kept filming as he spoke directly to his phone's camera. "Let the record show what we just witnessed," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that truth was the most powerful weapon against injustice. 3 police officers attacked an unarmed 15-year-old boy for the crime of walking while black. They tried to run him down with their vehicle. They destroyed his property. They terrorized a child. He turned the camera toward the officers on the ground. And now they want to know why 2 citizens intervened to stop them from committing assault. More patrol cars arrived, pulling up at a careful distance. The officers who stepped out moved slowly, cautiously. Word had already reached them about who was involved, but more importantly, they could see the crowd, the cameras, the undeniable evidence of what had transpired. A Latina officer with sergeant's stripes approached with her weapon holstered and her hands visible. She had seen the store's security footage on her patrol car's computer, had watched the entire incident unfold from multiple angles. There would be no cover-up, no thin blue line protection for officers who had crossed every line that mattered. "We got the call," she said to Cena and Dwayne. Store camera caught everything. She looked down at Marcus with genuine concern. "You hurt, son?" Marcus shook his head, finding his voice again. "They tried to run me over." The sergeant nodded grimly and turned to Rodriguez, who stood apart from his fellow officers, like a man awakening from a nightmare. "Did you witness excessive force?" she asked. Rodriguez looked at the ground, then at Marcus, then at the 2 men who had risked everything to do what he should have done from the beginning. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "They went too far." The bald officer started to protest, but the sergeant held up a hand. "Save it for internal affairs," she said, speaking into her radio to request investigators and supervisors. As handcuffs clicked around the wrists of the 2 corrupt officers, Marcus realized something profound was happening. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every child who had ever been targeted by those who were supposed to protect them. This was about a system that had been broken for so long that people had forgotten it could be fixed. The notebook in his hands was ruined, its pages torn and stained. But the dreams written inside, those were still alive, still possible, still worth fighting for. The diner's neon sign flickered against the gray sky like a beacon of hope in a world that had seemed determined to crush a boy's spirit. The warmth inside hit them like a gentle embrace, and the smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around Marcus like his mother's arms used to before everything fell apart. The older black woman behind the counter looked up from wiping down glasses, her silver braids catching the light from the vintage fixtures. Her eyes widened as she recognized the 2 massive men walking in with a teenage boy who looked like he'd been through a war. "Well, I'll be," she said with a chuckle that carried decades of wisdom and kindness. "If it isn't John Cena and The Rock. Y'all look cold and underdressed for this weather." "Yeah, it's been a morning," Cena replied, his voice still carrying the adrenaline from what had just happened. The woman's eyes shifted to Marcus, taking in his torn hoodie, the bruises on his face, the way he held that ruined notebook like it contained his entire world. She didn't need an explanation. She had seen too many boys like him, carrying pain too heavy for their young shoulders. "That little one with y'all?" she asked, her maternal instincts kicking in immediately. "He's with us now," Dwayne said firmly, and those 4 words carried the weight of a promise that would change Marcus's life forever. She nodded knowingly, and waved them toward a corner booth. "Sit wherever you like. I'll bring y'all something warm." Marcus slid into the booth, his notebook still tucked protectively under his arm. The vinyl seat was cracked but comfortable, and for the first time in months, he felt truly safe. Cena sat across from him, while Dwayne settled beside him, their presence like a shield against everything cruel and cold in the world outside. "You're safe now," Cena said gently. "Nobody's going to touch you here." The waitress returned with steaming hot chocolate for Marcus and black coffee for the men. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She just gave them space to breathe and begin healing from trauma that was still fresh and raw. Marcus opened his notebook slowly, revealing pages that were water-damaged but still legible. The ink had run in places, but the dreams were still there. Get Mom out of the hospital. Find a safe place to live. Go back to school. Make something that matters. Dwayne read over his shoulder, each item on the list hitting him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a 15-year-old survival manual, a roadmap for escaping poverty and despair written in pencil by someone who still believed in tomorrow despite everything today had thrown at him. "You want to do all this?" Dwayne asked, pointing to the list. "I want to try," Marcus said quietly. "I didn't think anyone cared until now." "We care," Cena said, reaching across the table, "and we're going to help you get there." For the next hour, they sat in that warm diner while Marcus slowly opened up about his life. He told them about his mother Teresa, hit by a drunk driver who ran a red light and fled the scene. He described coming home to find their apartment locked, the eviction notice he couldn't understand, the 2 months of sleeping in subway stations and laundromats and under bridges. "Sometimes I sleep at the station," he said, stirring his hot chocolate absently. "Sometimes under the overpass. One time in a laundromat until they kick me out. Mostly I just walk and try not to bother anybody." Each word was a dagger to both men's hearts. They had both known struggle, had both fought their way up from nothing, but hearing it from someone so young, so innocent, made their own challenges seem small by comparison. "That changes today," Dwayne said with absolute conviction. "We're going to get you somewhere warm tonight. Tomorrow we figure out how to get your mom the help she needs. And after that, Cena grinned, "we help you build the life you wrote about in that notebook." Marcus looked down at his ruined pages and made a decision. He took the pencil from his pocket and added a new line to his goals. "Help others the way they helped me." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the storm on social media was just beginning. The footage was everywhere, national news, trending hashtags, viral videos with millions of views. The 2 officers who had terrorized Marcus were being identified, investigated, and condemned by a public that had finally seen police brutality from an angle that couldn't be denied or explained away. But inside the diner, Marcus wasn't thinking about fame or viral videos. He was thinking about his mother lying alone in a hospital bed, probably wondering where her son was, probably blaming herself for not being strong enough to protect him from a world that seemed designed to destroy young black men. "Can we see her?" Marcus asked suddenly. "My mom, I mean. They wouldn't let me visit anymore because we couldn't pay. But maybe now." "We can do more than visit," Dwayne said, already pulling out his phone. "We can make sure she gets the care she needs." As he dialed numbers and made calls, using his connections and resources to cut through red tape and bureaucracy, Marcus watched with amazement. For months, he had felt powerless against a system that seemed determined to grind him down. Now he was watching that same system bend and reshape itself around the will of 2 men who refused to accept that a child's life didn't matter. Within an hour, arrangements had been made. Hospital administrators, who had been unreachable, suddenly became available. Social workers, who had been overwhelmed, suddenly found time in their schedules. Insurance issues that had seemed impossible to resolve suddenly became solvable. "Money talks," Cena explained. "But sometimes you need to speak louder than money. Sometimes you need to remind people that there's a human cost to bureaucracy." As they prepared to leave the diner, the waitress approached with a brown paper bag. "For the road," she said, pressing it into Marcus's hands. "And honey," she added, looking directly into his eyes. You remember this feeling. You remember that there are still good people in this world. And when you're all grown up and successful, and you will be, you remember to be one of them good people for somebody else who needs it. Marcus nodded, understanding that he was receiving more than food. He was being given a mission, a purpose, a reason to keep fighting when the world tried to break him down. They walked back into the cold, but now Marcus wasn't walking alone. He had two giants beside him, a warm meal in his stomach, and something he hadn't felt in months, the absolute certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. The city looked different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because Marcus's place in it had been transformed. He was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, no longer alone. He was a boy with protectors, with hope, with a future that stretched out before him like an open road. 3 weeks later, Marcus Williams sat at a small desk by the window in his room at the Transitional Youth Shelter, watching Los Angeles wake up under clear skies. The snow had melted away, leaving behind only memories and a city forever changed by what happened on that cold morning when two giants refused to look away. His notebook lay open beside him, not the ruined one from that day, but a new one. Clean pages filled with updated dreams, concrete plans, and most importantly, progress reports on goals that were actually being achieved instead of just wished for. The first page still read my dreams, but now it was followed by pages titled My Plans, My Support Team, and How I'll Help Others. What had once been desperate hopes, scribbled by a homeless boy, had evolved into an organized blueprint for success written by a young man with a future. Marcus had visited his mother every day since that morning in the snow. Teresa Williams was no longer lying forgotten in a hospital bed, wondering if she'd ever see her son again. Her medical bills were paid. Her treatment plan was comprehensive, and she was scheduled for transfer to a rehabilitation facility that specialized in helping accident victims rebuild their lives. "Baby, you look so different," she had said during their first reunion, tears streaming down her face as she held him close. "You look like you got hope again." And he did have hope, but more than that, he had proof that hope could become reality when the right people decided to care. Dwayne and Cena hadn't just rescued him from one bad situation. They had restructured his entire world. The transitional shelter where Marcus now lived was clean, safe, and staffed by people who understood that homeless youth needed more than just a bed. They needed counseling, educational support, life skills training, and most importantly, they needed adults who believed in their potential instead of writing them off as statistics. Marcus had been enrolled in a charter school known for working with students who had experienced disruption in their education. His first day back in a classroom after months on the street had been terrifying, but his teachers understood his situation and worked with him to catch up on missed material. "Education is your weapon against poverty," his math teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, had told him. Ironically, it was the same last name as the young police officer who had found his courage that snowy morning and was now working in a different precinct, trying to learn how to be the kind of cop his community needed. But the most profound change in Marcus's life wasn't the safe housing or the school enrollment or even his mother's improving health. It was the transformation in how he saw himself and his place in the world. John Cena and Dwayne Johnson had become more than rescuers. They had become mentors, father figures, living proof that success didn't have to mean forgetting where you came from or who needed help climbing up behind you. They visited regularly, not for photo opportunities or publicity, but because they genuinely cared about Marcus's progress. They celebrated when he passed his first exam in months, encouraged him when he struggled with nightmares about that morning, and most importantly, they kept their promise to help him build the life he had written about in his original notebook. "How's the new story coming?" Dwayne asked during one of their visits, noticing that Marcus had been writing more than just goals and plans. Marcus smiled and flipped to a section he hadn't shown them before. It was titled The Day Everything Changed, and it was his own account of that snowy morning, written from his perspective, but focusing not on the trauma, but on the transformation. "I want other kids to read this," Marcus explained. "Kids who think nobody cares about them. Kids who think the whole world is against them. I want them to know that sometimes help comes from places you never expected." Cena read a few paragraphs and nodded approvingly. This is powerful stuff, Marcus. Have you thought about sharing it more widely? Actually, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with confidence, I have an idea about that. He explained his plan to start a support group for homeless youth, a place where kids could share their stories, support each other, and most importantly, learn that surviving trauma could be the beginning of helping others do the same. I want to call it Second Chapters, he said, because everybody deserves a chance to rewrite their story. The program launched 6 months later with funding from a foundation that Dwayne and Cena had established specifically to support youth aging out of the foster system and experiencing homelessness. Marcus became the youngest peer counselor in the program's history, using his own experience to help other teenagers navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives. The police officers who had terrorized him that morning faced serious consequences. The bald officer and the red-headed one were not only fired but also faced criminal charges for assault and attempted vehicular homicide. Their cases became landmarks in police accountability, showing that even cops weren't above the law when their crimes were captured on camera and witnessed by people with the power to demand justice. Officer Rodriguez, the young cop who had found his conscience in time to do the right thing, became a community liaison officer specializing in youth outreach. He often spoke at Marcus's support group meetings, sharing his perspective on how good people could end up in bad situations and how finding the courage to stand up for what's right could change everything. I was scared, he admitted to one group of teenagers. Scared of my fellow officers, scared of losing my job, scared of being seen as weak. But I learned that the only thing scarier than standing up to bullies is becoming one yourself. Marcus's mother made a full recovery and found work as a patient advocate, helping other families navigate the healthcare system that had once seemed so cruel and indifferent. She often said that watching her son transform from a traumatized homeless boy into a confident young leader was better medicine than anything any doctor could prescribe. On the first anniversary of that snowy morning, Marcus stood before a crowd of city officials, community leaders, and fellow survivors to speak at the dedication of a new youth center funded by celebrity donations and community support. A year ago, I thought I was invisible, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I thought the world didn't see me, didn't care about me, would rather I just disappear. But I learned something that day in the snow. Being invisible isn't about whether people can see you. It's about whether they choose to look. He gestured toward Cena and Dwayne, who stood at the back of the crowd, beaming with pride. 2 men chose to look. They chose to see a kid who needed help instead of a problem to be ignored. And because they looked, because they cared, because they acted, my story got to have a different ending. Marcus paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, some young, some old, some scarred by their own struggles, all listening to a teenager who had found his voice in the darkness and decided to use it to light the way for others. But here's the thing, he continued, his voice growing stronger. Every single one of you has that same power. The power to look, the power to care, the power to act, the power to change someone's story just by deciding that their life matters. He held up his notebook, not the original one that had been destroyed in the snow, but the new one filled with dreams that were becoming reality, plans that were being executed, and goals that were being achieved. My first notebook got ruined that day, he said, but maybe that needed to happen. Maybe I needed to learn that dreams written on paper can be destroyed, but dreams written on your heart, those are indestructible. As applause filled the air and cameras captured the moment, Marcus thought about all the kids who were still out there, still invisible, still waiting for someone to choose to look. His story had a happy ending, but it was also a beginning, the start of a mission to make sure that no child ever again had to face the world's cruelty alone. The snow had melted, but the hope it had uncovered remained, growing stronger with each life it touched, each story it transformed, each heart it convinced to care about the invisible ones who just needed someone to see them. Marcus Williams was no longer invisible. More importantly, he was making sure that others didn't have to be either.